Başlayalım mı? Evet. Arkadaşlar bu hafta lingüistik tipoloji seminerlerinin ikincisi olacak. Ve konuğumuz değerli Luba Veselinova yeni bir konu üzerinde duracak. Metodolojik konular ele alacak.
Hello everyone, thanks for coming back. So I will track back to where we left off in the last lecture and give you the brief story of how typology started, because I think it's important to tie to the methodological issues that I'm going to discuss today. Universalist thinking. I don't know if we can do something on this slide. Can you read this text here? Is it visible? People have been trying to find common denominators among languages since antiquity, since we know. So in classical antiquity, there have been statements about how languages are structured in a common way. The same can be said about the Middle Ages. The problem is that when the classical grammarians and the Buddhists in the Middle Ages thought about grammatical structures and wrote grammars, they were based on one language, so classical Greek and Latin. And our, at least in the Western way of thinking, our grammatical notions are very much shaped by whatever grammatical thinking was in the Middle Ages. So, and in European classical antiquity, if we had contact, for instance, with the Arabic world and China, our grammatical notions would have been different. But now we think in terms of classes of nouns and verbs, morphosyntactic categories that come from here, which are not necessarily universal, but people thought of them as universal. And I'll come to thinking in even modern times when these notions come to be thought as universal. And then this thinking is inherited in the French Enlightenment period in Grammaire Post-Royale in the 17th century. But in practice, all of these, like, even though the ambition was to say something about how human languages work, there were very few languages that were studied. But we can't ignore them because of what I said. Our very basic notions come from them. Then in the 19th century, what was born then by the neo-grammarians in Germany, and there Schlegel and von Humboldt, was morphological typology. And I will come to this when I discuss morphological typology today, but what these people looked at, and they looked at Sanskrit. So they went outside of Europe, which is an achievement. But they gave us notions about morphological structure. So Turkish was characterized as an agglutinating language. Transparent morphological structure was characterized as agglutinating. Lack of morphological structure was characterized as primitive or isolating. Morphological structure where you would have some agglutination and some heavy-duty phonological processes that would influence the shape of morphemes was defined as inflectional. And then they even looked at some languages that looked very exotic at that time, where words in the Indo-European sense could not be distinguished. There was a fair amount of incorporation, and they characterized them as polysynthetic. So there were four global typologies. A language could be thought as as if a language could belong to one morphological type. So all of Turkish is agglutinating, which we know is not true. All of French is inflectional. Mandarin, and at that time Mandarin was referred to as Chinese, that's isolating and primitive, maybe what they knew about Nahuatl. So Nahuatl is a Yugo-Aztecan language spoken in the Yugo-Aztecan Empire, so they could refer to Nahuatl as polysynthetic. So people have proved that this notion of holistic typology is really very misleading, but this is what we inherited from them. And these notions are still very pervasive in typological thinking. Humboldt is in the same school. So between the late 19th century, the neo-grammarians, and the first half of the 20th century, we have a lot of grammars produced and Saussure. But what we saw in the first half of the 20th century was the birth of anthropological linguistics in Columbia University, where Edward Sapir and then Boas started looking at Amerindian languages and the native languages of the Americas as objects that were interesting to study. So they founded the Department of Anthropological Linguistics, and they also introduced the notion of language comparison, and this is American structuralism, where they said that, well, these languages are so different from our languages. There is no basis for comparison, and languages can vary to the utmost amounts. Now this is important because I'm going to come back to this today. That was subsequently rejected. In typology, people said, no, we can't compare languages. There are limits to variation, and there also we can see that variation can be is not haphazard. There is a system to variation. But that notion of the fact that languages differ and differ in unpredictable ways is coming back today. You'll see why. Then the Prague structuralism, which occurred approximately at the same time in the 20s, and that was the Prague Linguistic Circle. It was led by Vladimir Skalichka, but Nikolai Trubetskoy and Roman Jakobson, two Russian immigrants, took place there, took part in it. And they introduced important notions in phonological typology and the notion of markedness, which I'm going to come back to in later lectures. And it's also very important in typology today. Then in the 60s, in Stanford, there came Greenberg and Joseph Greenberg. And this is much of the figure that has shaped modern typology, or at least typology the way it was practiced until today. The past 50, 40 years have been shaped by Greenberg and his students. Bill Croft, whose book you're supposed to read as a course book, was a student of Greenberg. When I studied in Michigan, I studied with another student of Greenberg who is unfortunately no longer with us, Keith Denning. Keith Denning never wrote books. He said himself that he likes to see himself as a teacher. But he helped Croft a lot, and he has helped a lot of other typologists because he was a great thinker. He just didn't like to write. A lot about Greenberg, and I'm naming two of his students here, but he founded the school of typology the way we see it today. His way of comparison was very structural. He never tried to do holistic typologies except for word order. His very important contribution was to try not to look at features in isolation, but to look at how features correlate with each other. So he introduced the notion of universals and the implication of universals. He did a lot of other crazy stuff like dividing Africa in some zones that are very unrealistic. But we refer to his universals today. A lot of the universals we argue with, but a lot of his basic notions and way of thinking are going to be used for some time to come. So this is why I wanted to not to miss this part from previous lecture. So I'll go over to the lecture that's supposed to take part today. So now we're going to go over to how we do these comparisons, and they're Greenbergian comparisons. So in a very general way, we're going to start on a typological project and look at the stages of how a typological project evolves. We need to form our comparative concepts. I'll talk about this. We need to select a set of languages that we're going to look at, and that's sampling. We need to collect the data from the languages we selected, and we need to organize these data. We need to gloss them. All of these are things that take time, and some of them are not great fun, but you need to do them so that other people understand what you're doing. We need to, suppose we've collected our data and glossed them in a comprehensible way. We need to further analyze them, see what kind of generalizations we can make, and look for correlations between the features we've been looking at and other features of the languages we've been looking at that are relevant for whatever we look at. And then we need to start seeking for explanations. In typology, explanations are thought in terms of what languages are used for. So function and function again, it's a very functionally based field. We look at areal features. Who do these people talk to, willingly or unwillingly, but who are they in contact with? And how this influenced their way of speaking and thinking. What kind of history these things have, and how this history is reflected in what we see today. I'm going to look at analysis, generalizations, all of this stuff is going to be left out. But this is a general outline of what a typological project ultimately comes to look like. Today I'm going to try to wade through that, and I left glossing in the last place because I really wasn't aware of the fact that people here haven't glossed, but I'm going to start with glossing. So I'm going to explain glossing fairly soon. But now suppose you want to start look at something. You need to define what you want to look at, what's interesting to you. I told you last time, like I needed a project, you look at stuff, usually you go to lectures such as these, and you see what phenomena are being discussed, and then you probably ask your lecturer, well, is it worth looking at X? The way I didn't hear anything about ordinals, and I asked my lecturer then, well, is it worth looking at? So you define your question and the concept that is related to it, and you start building your database. You have to select languages, you have to find your sources, you have to analyze and generalize, and you have to start classifying. You will calculate your frequencies of whatever you classified, and usually you want to calculate in several different ways. Then you look at the geography of the features you looked at, and then you will establish correlations. Now, the data sources for typologies, they will depend on whatever you want to study. but they're generally grammars. Many people find this problematic, so grammars have been written in different points in time, in very different perspectives. Some of them will contain the information we're looking for, others won't, and that's a fact of life. So apart from grammars are very basic, we need them. But usually nowadays there are people who even deny this kind of comparison because the argument is, well, you want to say something about the functions of language and you want to explain why languages are the way they are, and you look at one source written by somebody from a very subjective point of view. This is not what, this is a very limited source. And that's true, but for many languages this is the only source I'm going to have. So my argument is I'd better look at that source and be honest about it than not look at it at all. Then there are other pedagogical materials. There are teacher self-books. For some things they're not so bad. There are various descriptions, even dictionaries. Some dictionaries could be very useful. Then there are questionnaires. If you're versed enough, and in the later stages of your career, maybe not your first typological project, but if you move on, you will look at a phenomenon, say tense and aspect, and you want to look at how evidentials influence the tense and aspect system of a language. You should be able to think of situations where evidentials are used together with specific tense and aspect forms and design questions that you ask people. I'm going to cite the questionnaire of my former advisor, and the questionnaire that's being used exactly for the description of tense and aspect system is the one that Østen Dahl designed for his study of tense aspect and mood systems in '85. It consists of about 104 questions, and it is a translation questionnaire. So he gave people sentences in English, but he tried to avoid every time you translate, the source language will influence you. So he tried to stay away from the influence of English as much as he could. So the question is, okay, imagine a question of what did you do yesterday evening? And since he doesn't know the language, he doesn't want like a real narrative, whatever you did yesterday evening. He gives them a specific sentence that would translate an imaginary activity of what you did yesterday evening, and the sentence and what the person is supposed to say is like, I wrote letters. But instead of writing the English grammatical sentence, yesterday evening I wrote letters, he said, okay, the setting is your activity yesterday evening I write letters. So whatever is suitable for your language, you stick it in there. People were asked, and there was a voluntary work that some of the people he asked were linguists, but he sent the questionnaire to about 150 different speakers. He received answers from 65. So this is what his book is about, like based on the questionnaire of these situations. But such questionnaires have been. There is another lingua questionnaire that is supposed to help you describe the whole language, there is now a library of such questionnaires at the Max Planck Institute. The URL is on your handout. But those questionnaires there, the lingua questionnaire is there, a bunch of other questionnaires are there. So if you're out for describing a specific phenomenon that there is a question, they already have a questionnaire from, go and consult it. because it may help you. And usually, when I do my questionnaires on negation, because I'm doing negation now, but usually don't stick to one source. You use grammars and you use a questionnaire. Use a combination of sources. Then nowadays the craze is parallel corpora. Parallel corpora consists of combining books that have been translated into many languages, say Harry Potter, The Little Prince, the Bible, things that are popular in the world, and we can get them in many translations. So we align them sentence by sentence, and we get information from the translations. It's very effective if you look at specific structural phenomena. It's very effective if you want to look at lexical typology, because no grammar will ever tell you anything about the structure of vocabulary. The problem with parallel corpora is that you still need to understand what's going on. So you still need the grammars. The more serious issue with parallel corpora is that they cannot be easily shared because of copyright issues. Harry Potter is copyrighted, The Little Prince is copyrighted, Pippi Longstocking is copyrighted, a bunch of books are copyrighted. So some people have such parallel corpora hidden, and they use them, and if you ask them to share them with you, then they say, well, okay, but you don't tell anyone else because I'm going to be sued, and the threat is real. They can get into some serious legal issues. Nobody wants to get there. In Stockholm we have a parallel corpus of about 1,000 Bibles. Not the whole Bible, but the New Testament, and in the New Testament I think we have the Gospel of Mark in most translations. It's not because we are particularly religious, but the Bible is not copyrighted, so we can go through it, and we can find the stuff we want to find. Östendahl and Bernard Oakley, they're both very good typologists. They're working on resultative constructions, and a lot of their material comes from the parallel Bible corpus. But a lot of people, since people deny the grammars as a source, a lot of people say, no, we should go to real text. Well, if the only real text that I can get without getting into real danger of being jailed is the Bible, I think is, I mean, it's still a very restricted text, even if it does not restrict my freedom. But this is where we are right now. We do want to use more textual data. People are also trying to design spoken language corpora. In Paris, there are Amina Metouchi and her collaborators, and they have a pretty much working corpus of Berber varieties. That is a spoken language corpus, and it's also as parallel as they get with parallel corpora. But this is something new and good. So the ambition is to get corpus data and possibly argue with the lawmakers that we're not selling and we don't have any other game but scientific purposes, so we can get around copyright issues and we can translate books. Another text that is also advertised as a parallel corpus is the Declaration of Human Rights in the UN. That is not religious. It is freely available. It's also very limited, but you can sift through its vocabulary and get stuff from there. Now there are sources on sources that I started the Globalog that is fairly new and recent. There is the World Atlas of Language Structure and the work of Carl Hammarström, that is that appears in a book form too, a handbook of descriptive knowledge, and then the ethnologue. Finally, there is a very good virtual catalog that I recommend you to search. It's based in Germany. It's a catalog that it's a crawler. So in this catalog, all of the Western libraries are connected. So when you search there, the search is slow. So it goes through all of Western Europe, Russia, North America, and those libraries in South America that are connected there. Unfortunately, they're not very many, but the ones that are connected are there. So it gets you pretty much, it's on your handout, so don't try to copy it from here, because I can barely see it. But it's called Karlsruhe, and I definitely recommend it for search of books. It will also get you to electronic texts and electronic bookstores. So it's a very good resource. Now, these are pretty much ready-made and supposedly tailored to the needs of the linguist. And I've been on these discussions when people are designing them, and what was advertised as a positive part was, well, you don't get all the junk that you get when you search on Google. But as a scholar, sometimes I want the junk. In fact, I want everything, because I want to see what's out there. And I want to decide what is junk and what is not. These are competent and very good starting points, but I don't want to be restricted to them, and I don't recommend to anyone to just stick to whatever anyone said it has been written on Martu Tunira or Persian or anything. Do your own search, and that's a good place to start. And then there is like Google, and then there is archive.org. Archive.org, I believe that they are legal. They're there, and nobody has sued them yet. But they have a lot of electronic texts. So you can go download grammars, you can download texts, especially in Native American languages. They're very good on Native American language texts. So you can download whole text, you can download dictionaries, and it's all free, it's public. So I think they have solved whatever there is to be solved on the legal side. Archive.org is easy to remember. And if you want to do like even a small scale typological study, I recommend you to go there. The doculect is the term that, since, I told you, when people come to us and we tell them how we work, especially the funding agencies, they don't like to, when we tell them, well, we work with grammars, and at the same time we tell you that we explain everything there is to explain about human languages. So the term, so we were explaining to, I forget who, but the work we do, and there were discussions between Michal Sisov, Jeff Good, and Martin Hastelmat, all of them very big scholars in typology. They came up with this term doculect because what we do is we look at a specific variety of a language that's being documented. And this is what we tell our funding agencies. We work with doculects. We don't even pretend to be looking at languages as a whole, because the nature of our comparison, we want to cover the world, we think it's valuable and informative, it precludes us from doing extensive interviews. We do them when we can, but essentially we do language documentation on a world scale. And that's the doculect. It would be good to understand. There is like the story of the doculect in Glottopedia. Glottopedia is the linguist's correspondent of Wikipedia. So now I will, those are the abbreviations. You can mark this page on your handout. I'm going over to glossing. So I've explained word sources. We start the typological project, and I will come to the comparative concepts and how you select languages. But since you're not familiar with glossing, I think I should start with that. Those are the abbreviations that are used in the examples I'm going to go through. And so when you look at grammars, you're going to be asked, like, say, I'm going to be talking about the dative case today and how we define the dative case in comparative terms. So you have to get to examples and then gloss them. Glossing means that you do a morphological analysis in the sense that you separate the morphemes that are lexical and have a lexical meaning, and the morphemes that are grammatical and have a grammatical meaning. So in a glossed example, in a typological work, you need at least 3 lines. So here I've written the Russian example in a transliterated orthography. And I have separated thou and then the feminine. Okay. Then I've made a mistake, but or I've lost. I'll come back to that. But the dash means, and the hyphen means that this is a morpheme boundary, according to me, or whatever the grammar told me. And this is how you go to knigu, which is the form of book in accusative. I separate the lexical stem and then the case suffix. And finally we come to malchicum, which is boy in dative, and I separate what I think is the stem and the case suffix. So the second line is the morphological, the translation of these morphemes, usually in English, or in whatever language you're writing, so that your reader will understand. And the third line is the idiomatic translation of that sentence. I didn't want to make it more complicated than that, but usually there is a fourth line, and that's really a first line where you write the sentence in the original script of the language, if the language has a script, and in the original orthography. And then you write the transliteration, and then the morphomatic translation, and then the idiomatic translation. There are people who can complicate this to infinity, but in a typological work, you expect to see at least those 3 lines in an example. And people and usually this gives the reader an idea of what the morphemes in this sentence look like. And people may give me some hint, for instance, how I transliterated like the Russian form here, because actually the stem could be analyzed in a different way. I could draw the morpheme boundary here to da, which is the semi-stem to forgive, and then put the hyphen here.